Delta Airlines Flight 841. On July 31st, 1972, Delta Airlines Flight 841, en route from Detroit to Miami, became the scene of a brutal hijacking set in motion by members of the Black Liberation Army. The three hijackers, along with 3 women and 2 children, smuggling weapons on board, including a gun hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible, commandeered the Douglas DC-8 with 101 people on board, including 94 passengers and 7 crew members. Despite the frightening situation, the hijackers ensured no fatalities occurred. After reaching Miami, an approximate sum of $1 million as extortion money placed in a blue suitcase was dragged inside the airplane with a rope, and 86 passenger hostages were released. But the plane then diverted to Boston. There, the jet was refueled, a flight engineer boarded, and provisions such as cigarettes and sandwiches were loaded onto the aircraft. The plane then headed to Algiers, where the Algerian government seized both the plane and the ransom before returning the crew and aircraft to the US. However, the hijackers were released after a few days. Following international efforts, 4 hijackers were captured in France in 1976, serving brief prison terms before settling in France. The 5th hijacker, George Wright, remained on the run until his capture in Portugal in 2011, where he avoided extradition to the US due to his Portuguese citizenship, thus making this event one of the most complex hijackings of history. TWA Flight 847. In June 1985, TWA Flight 847 took off from Cairo with 139 passengers on board. This intercontinental flight was scheduled for multiple layovers at Athens, Rome, Boston, and Los Angeles. But its journey was cut short on June 14, 1985, when the plane took to the skies from the runway of Athens, Greece. During this layover, 2 Arab-speaking Lebanese men smuggled 9mm guns and grenades on the flight. A short while after the plane took off, it was hijacked by the men who demanded all passengers with Jew-sounding names to identify themselves. However, the motive behind this incident was something else: a release of all Lebanese Shias, including those involved in the 1983 bombings of the US Embassy. The hijackers held the Captain Testrake at gunpoint and forcefully diverted the plane to Beirut International Airport, where 19 passengers were allowed to leave in exchange for fuel. Throughout the flight, passengers and crew were tied and beaten repeatedly. Still, at this specific stop, they cornered US Navy driver Robert Stetham, shot him right in the temple, and threw his body at the Beirut tarmac before firing again. Around a dozen armed men boarded the plane, and then it took off to Algiers on June 15th, where a further 65 passengers and female crew were let go. By June 17th, the remaining 40 passengers were taken hostage by Hezbollah at different locations throughout Beirut. They remained there until June 30th, when US President Ronald Reagan finally intervened and held diplomatic negotiations with a few Lebanese officials. The hostages were finally sent back to the US, where the US president welcomed them. Over the next few weeks, Israel released the 700 hostages, although the country kept denying its relevance to the hijacking. American Airlines Flight 119. On June 23, 1972, American Airlines Flight 119, a Boeing 727, was hijacked shortly after departing St. Louis for Tulsa. The hijacker, 28-year-old Robert Wilson, boarded the flight with a briefcase containing a modified Spitfire machine gun, a small-caliber pistol, a smoke grenade, and a wig. He purchased a $70 round-trip ticket, passing through security without any checks. After takeoff, Wilson initially appeared harmless, even engaging in conversation with a fellow passenger. As the plane approached Tulsa, he made the fateful decision to execute his plan. He went to the lavatory, wore the wig and gloves, and armed himself before confronting the crew. Emerging from the restroom, Wilson brandished his weapon and demanded the flight crew comply with his instructions. His motivation was basically based on his financial crisis, having invested $1,500 into the hijacking scheme. At first, he demanded the pilots to divert the plane back to St. Louis, but shortly changed his mind and asked to fly to Dallas before changing his mind back to landing at St. Louis. He then placed his demands for the authorities on the ground, which were quite similar to D.B. Cooper. Wilson asked for $500,000 in cash, 5 parachutes along with the manuals on how to use them. After landing in St. Louis, he released 91 of the 92 passengers and allowed 2 officials on board. The flight attendants, surprised yet compliant, worked to defuse the situation. The hijacker transferred to another plane, taking pilots, crew, and one passenger hostage, and demanded to be flown to Toronto and then New York. At 2:50 a.m., somewhere over Indiana, the hijacker, who went by Robert Wilson, parachuted out of the plane at 8,000 feet. In the jump, he lost his money and machine gun, both later discovered by farmers. Authorities identified the hijacker as Martin J. McNally, a former Navy sailor who was eventually captured and sentenced to 2 life terms. Pan Am Flight 73. Pan Am Flight 73, bound for New York from Bombay, with scheduled stops in Karachi and Frankfurt, became the target of a terrible hijacking on September 5, 1986. The Boeing 747, carrying 360 passengers and 19 crew, had just arrived in Karachi when 4 armed members of the Abu Nidal organization, disguised as airport security, stormed the aircraft. Armed with rifles, grenades, and explosive belts, they gained control, terrifying passengers and crew. The hijackers forced the first and business class passengers to the back, gathering passports to identify Americans. One of the flight attendants courageously hid some American passports to protect passengers from being singled out. The hijackers demanded that the cockpit crew, which had shortly escaped, return to the plane. Upon realizing that the plane could not be flown without them, lead hijacker Safarini shot American passenger as a show of force. The hostage lasted for several hours, yet seeing that their message was not getting across, the hijackers opened fire, filling the cabin with bullets and grenades. Panic shot through the passengers, yet some managed to escape through the emergency exits. The aftermath saw 21 fatalities and 120 injuries, though most on board survived. The hijackers were later arrested and sentenced in Pakistan, with Safarini receiving additional sentencing in the United States. FedEx Flight 705. On April 7, 1994, FedEx Flight 705, a McDonnell Douglas DC-1030 freighter, faced a terrifying hijacking attempt mid-flight. Auburn R. Calloway, a FedEx Flight engineer flying as a deadhead passenger, attempted to take control of the plane with a violent plan to crash it for a life insurance payout of $2.5 million for his family. Armed with a spear gun and multiple hammers hidden in a guitar case, Calloway attacked 3 crew members, Captain David Sanders, First Officer James Tucker, and Flight Engineer Andrew Peterson at 19,000 feet. Despite severe injuries, the crew fought back, with Tucker using sharp moves like steep climbs and dives to disorient Calloway. At one point, Peterson wrestled the spear gun from Calloway while Tucker regained some control over the aircraft. Eventually, the crew managed to control him, bringing the damaged plane back to Memphis International Airport, 16,000 kilograms over its maximum landing weight. For their bravery, the crew survived, but sustained serious injuries, and Calloway received 2 life sentences. The aircraft, remarkably, remained in service with FedEx for nearly 30 years, only being placed in storage in 2023. Air France Flight 8969. On December 24, 1994, Air France Flight 8969 was hijacked by 4 armed Islamic group terrorists at Algiers airport. Disguised as Algerian presidential police, the hijackers initially stayed calm and started checking the passports of the 220 passengers of the Airbus A300, with 12 crew members, but soon revealed themselves as mujahideen, wanting to establish an Islamic state in France. The plane was soon surrounded by the Algerian military and the counterterrorism forces. Negotiations continued, and the hijackers demanded the release of 2 Algerian political group FIS leaders, but later shifted their demand to flying over to Paris for a press conference where they intended to detonate the plane. Despite intense negotiations and standoffs, the Algerian government refused to meet the hijackers' demands. In a move to show their force, the hijackers shot 1 Algerian police and Vietnamese diplomat on board. On December 26, the plane was allowed to depart to Marseille, where French counterterrorism unit took action. The unit stormed the plane, successfully killing all 4 hijackers and rescuing the hostages. However, 25 people, including passenger, crew members, and special units personnel, were injured during the operation. The incident led Air France to suspend its Algeria flights for nearly a decade until 2004. Southern Airways Flight 49. The 1972 hijacking of Southern Airways Flight 49 was a high-stakes event spanning over 30 hours and covering 4,000 miles across 3 countries. It began after takeoff from Birmingham, Alabama, when 3 armed men, Melvin Cale, Louis Moore, and Henry D. Jackson Jr., brandished handguns and grenades, taking control of the DC-9 with 35 people aboard. Facing criminal charges themselves, the hijackers demanded a ransom of $10 million and threatened to crash the plane into the Oak Ridge nuclear research reactor unless the ransom was met. This was one of the most severe threats in the U.S. aviation history, and thus, the FBI scrambled to negotiate and could only gather around $2 million, far short of the demand. The plane hopscotched across the U.S. and Canada, landing in cities like Cleveland, Detroit, and Toronto as demands evolved. At one stop, FBI agents tried to disable the plane by shooting out 2 of its tires, but the hijackers retaliated by shooting the co-pilot, forcing the flight to continue. Eventually, they reached Havana, Cuba, where they hoped for sanctuary. However, Fidel Castro refused to harbor them. After a standoff, Cuban authorities captured the hijackers, who later served prison sentences in both Cuba and the U.S. The ordeal prompted the U.S. to institute mandatory physical screenings for airline passengers in January 1973, marking a turning point in aviation security. Eastern Airlines Flight 1320. On March 17, 1970, Eastern Airlines Shuttle Flight 1320, operating a McDonnell Douglas DC-931, was hijacked while flying from Newark to Boston. The hijacker, John J. DeVivo, armed with a .38 caliber revolver, ordered Captain Robert Wilbur Jr. to fly east and to notify him when the plane was low on fuel. During the hijacking, DeVivo shot Captain Wilbur in the arm, severely wounding him. Co-pilot James Hartley also sustained gunshot wounds, but managed to wrestle the gun from DeVivo, shooting him 3 times before collapsing and later dying from his injuries. Captain Wilbur communicated with Boston Air Traffic Control, alerting them that both he and Hartley had been shot and needed immediate assistance upon landing. In a remarkable display of skill, despite his severe gunshot wounds, he successfully landed the aircraft with 68 passengers and 5 crew members on board. The flight landed safely at Logan International Airport, where emergency services were waiting. DeVivo was arrested at the scene, but committed suicide awaiting trial. This incident was the first aircraft hijacking in U.S. history to result in a death, significantly impacting future aviation security protocols. Air France Flight 139. On June 27, 1976, Air France Flight 139, en route from Tel Aviv to Paris, was hijacked shortly after takeoff. The aircraft, carrying 248 passengers and crew, was commandeered by members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, External Operations, and the German Revolutionary Cells. Armed with hand grenades and automatic weapons, the hijackers forced the flight to land in Athens, where they took on additional hijackers before redirecting the plane to Entebbe, Uganda. Once on the ground, the hijackers moved the passengers to a cramped old terminal and demanded an immediate release of 40 Palestinians held in Israel and 13 others detained in Kenya and France. During this tense situation, one of the female passengers faked a miscarriage to gain the hijacker's sympathy and secure her freedom. With the passing days, the situation became dire as the hijackers threatened to execute the passengers if their demands were not met. Faced with this urgency, the Israeli government began planning a rescue operation. On July 4th, Israeli commandos launched a raid, storming the terminal where the passengers were held, killing all but 3 of the hijackers and securely rescuing 102 passengers.